Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for the Fostering Success Michigan Life Domains webinar series. We're so pleased to have all of you joining us, and we look forward to an exciting webinar today. My name is Maddie Day, and I am the Director of Outreach and Training with the Center for Fostering Success. And we will have just a few housekeeping items before we dive in. I just want to remind everybody that all attendees are in listen-only mode. If you would like to ask questions or would like to have a clarification, you may use the chat or questions feature in your sidebar. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please call the Citrix team at the number that you see on the screen here. Of course, the recording will be available on the Fostering Success Michigan website in our resource library following the conclusion of this webinar. We would like to say a very special thank you to our funders, the Kresge Foundation, the Havermill Foundation, and Western Michigan University for the support that they have for all of the Fostering Success Michigan activities. And today we have a special guest, Jessie Fullenkamp from the Ruth Ellis Center. And so we'd like to say welcome to Jessie. Welcome, Jessie.
Thank you.
So let's dive in. As many of you know, January is the month where we at Fostering Success Michigan are going to be focusing on the identity domain. This webinar in particular is one that would be great for young people, young adults, students, professionals, and supportive adults. Throughout this webinar, you will have an overview of the 7 life domains by Casey Family Programs, and we also want to point you on your sidebar to the handouts feature where you can see the 7 life domains framework handout that we've provided. This is also available on the fosteringsuccessmichigan.com website. We will then provide an overview of the identity domain, and we're going to talk about why this domain is important, and then we're going to highlight some of the work in our network, and particularly this month we're going to highlight the work of the Ruth Ellis Center, and then we're going to provide some resources, and of course at the end we will have a time for questions. So please definitely feel free to send us your questions. If you send them throughout the broadcast, we'll be sure to hold them until the end, but there will be time at the end for us to get those questions answered. So let's talk about the 7 life domains. So the Casey Family Program 7 Life Domains framework that we use comes from the Casey Family Program's It's My Life framework that was developed in 2006. Many of you are familiar with this if you have been a part of the Center for Fostering Success activities and Fostering Success Michigan community collaboratives. You know that throughout the 2016 and 17 school year, we have been focusing on an individual life domain each month. We have adapted these life domains that come from Casey Family Programs to have education at the center because we are an education organization. We believe that the 7 Life Domains framework offers a way to organize, understand, and help young people develop a response to the complexity of their lived experiences. We've seen over and over again the relevance that young people find and the helpfulness that they find when they're able to identify both successes and challenges in each of these life domains as they are making their way to and through young adulthood. So today we're going to talk about the identity domain, which I will say up front is a very complex domain. And, you know, I think as we dive into some of the complexities of this, it's important to focus, or for all of our attendees to understand that while we are focusing on certain aspects of cultural and personal identity today, there are many, many parts of identity that are important. And we're going to get into just a few ways that we kind of sort of look at the identity domain and really construct it when we are looking at how this can best support our young people with experience in foster care. So first of all, I'll say that personal identity refers to the ways in which a person feels a sense of ownership, identity, or attachment about what makes them the person that they are. There's several ways that we break down identity. There is cultural identity, so belonging to a larger cultural group that has a distinct identity within itself. There is social identity that is often named by society and connects us to other more groups that are identified from within our society. So some of these examples are race, ethnicity, socioeconomic class, ability status, religion or spirituality, age, nationality, first language, sexual orientation, biological sex assignment at birth, and gender identity or expression. Of course, one thing that's really important is that while folks may have similar, they may identify with similar groups, it's always really important to understand that even though you identify with similar groups, no two people will have the same expression of their identity. The Center for Fostering Success takes a cultural humility approach to the understanding of identity. And by that, we really take the approach that with all of our young people and all of the people that we work with, professionals and supportive adults included, we really look to them to understand how they identify and what that identity means to them. And so while, again, somebody may identify in a certain way, we are looking to them to share with us what that means. We also add into sort of under the category of social identities the identity of the experience of foster care, and we really see the culture of foster care as providing both a unique lived experience but also sort of a unique cultural experience that young people who experience that carry with them into their life. We also see identities as intersectional, so meaning that no one person is just their own identity, and that people may experience multiple identities, that they may experience multiple identities over time, and that those identities may look or different depending on the experiences of the young person or of that person. And that there is no sort of trumping, I guess I would say, of an identity. So no one identity is more important in the sense of how a person identifies, that we want all people that we work with, young people and professionals included, to identify in the way that feels most important to them. So we also just want to say that all identities are interconnected and multifaceted, and so while again we may be speaking to one part of identity today, please understand that there are many parts and that we are aware of this and that we are always striving to provide resources that can really build and provide a holistic approach to all folks who are trying to understand and navigate identity development. Lastly, I just want to say that a few things unique to the experience of foster care. So some of the things that we found is that young adults who experience foster care or homelessness may have fewer opportunities to develop a sense of personal and cultural identity. This can be due to lack of family support. Of course, we know that young people move, and sort of separation from a traditional family concept can in some ways sort of disrupt this identity development. The other thing that we know is that the systems of child welfare and juvenile justice lack adequate supports for identity development of the young people that they serve. We know that there are some supports, I would say Michigan Youth Opportunities being a big one that we have here in Michigan, that do address identity as part of their work, but overall we do see these challenges when it comes to the support to develop a healthy, positive identity for system-involved young people. So at the end of the day, why do we talk about this? We really, feel like it's important to talk about and address identity and really supporting young people to build a strong, positive sense of identity, because we see it as directly correlated to increases in confidence, resiliency, and a healthy self-image. So we believe that as our young people grow and move into young adulthood, that a strong, positive sense of self and identity will help increase their long-term success. And so with that, I am going to invite Jessie to join us and share a little bit about the Ruth Ellis Center. So Jessie, if you could just tell us a little bit about the Ruth Ellis Center, and you see we have your mission here, but if you want to expand on that and share us a little bit about what you all do, that would be great.
Excellent. Thank you, Maddie, for that foundation and framework to set us up for success for the rest of this webinar. Again, I'm Jessie, and I am at the Ruth Ellis Center. We are located in Highland Park and Detroit, and we work with youth between the ages of 4 and 30 years old who are in the foster care system experiencing homelessness or at risk of experiencing homelessness, and who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or bi-attractional, transgender, and questioning. And for younger youth, sometimes they might not use that language to identify, but have gender expression that is creative or not traditional, and therefore experience rejecting or unsafe behaviors from their primary caregivers. And so we do family work with those young people. So the Ruth Ellis Center is 18 years old now, and we started in Detroit, and we're founded by professionals, I'm sure, very similar to many of the folks who are on this webinar, who were working with youth in different systems of care, including post-secondary education, and seeing that there were identity-specific services for youth, not as robust as they needed to be, but there were identity-specific services for youth often related to affirm and support race and ethnicity, or to affirm and support religious minorities, or affirm and support people based on gender identity. But there weren't a lot of services, especially in child welfare and foster care, to affirm and support youth who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and questioning. And the acronym that I'll use during this webinar is LGBTQ, which is not the only or only right way to summarize the community that we work with and that we're naming today, but it's one of the ways to try to have an umbrella term to include as many folks as possible. So these professionals saw that LGBTQ youth were really falling through the cracks, especially in foster care, because there was no way for them to safely come out. And if folks did come out or were outed, it was often an unsafe situation for them, which really went back to workers not always having the support that they needed to know how to best work with young people as well as their families. So the Ruth Ellis Center really came out of seeing that happening, and one of the statistics that is probably most clear in the need for services is that nationwide 40% of youth experiencing homelessness identify as LGBTQ. So that means that 4 out of 10 young people experiencing homelessness are LGBTQ, but we know that 4 out of 10 youth are not of the general population LGBTQ. So this community is disproportionately represented in the homeless community, which is unfortunately related to, more often than not, experiencing rejection at home and being kicked out when outed or coming out to family. So if we want to go to the next slide, I can talk a little bit more about the work that we do at the Ruth Ellis Center. And for folks who are in Wayne County, some of this information might also translate to potential referrals. I'm not going to go very in-depth with eligibility since we have folks from all over the state and the Midwest listening. But if you do have more questions about how to refer young people in Wayne County to the Ruth Ellis Center, my contact information is connected to this webinar, so please feel free to reach out to us. So like I mentioned, our roots of our work was really in kind of crisis response to youth that were involved in foster care and child welfare. And so we originally started a runaway and homeless youth drop-in center space close to Palmer Park, if folks are familiar with Detroit. And then quickly we opened up residential foster care. And we opened up residential foster care not because we think a residential facility is the best place for young people. We know that the research tells us, and in our own lived experience, we know that young people being with families, whether it's their birth family or a foster or adoptive family, that is the best option to have that consistent support. Unfortunately for LGBTQ youth, they are more likely to be in foster care, and once they're in foster care, they're less likely to be adopted. And so our residential facility was opened really as kind of a almost 10th tier safety net after all of the other options had been explored for stability and support for young people between the ages of 12 and to their 18th birthday. So the youth who live with us are temporary or permanent wards of the state. We also, under certain circumstances, can take youth from juvenile justice as a diversion bed. We are not a lockdown facility. It's residential foster care, so it is what I like to call helicopter parenting foster care. You know, we have 24/7, 365 line of sight. And the goal of the residential foster care, again, is to really be a safe space for LGBTQ youth to be themselves while figuring out how they might be able to get back into a home environment, if not with their birth family, with another foster or adoptive family. So a lot of the youth who we work with in a residential facility are involved in MYOI, and if they go on to post-secondary education, are really benefiting from the resources that many of you on this webinar provide. And so we're really grateful to your work and support. Just a couple of other notes about the work we do at the Ruth Ellis Center. We also have an integrated health and wellness center in partnership with Henry Ford Health System. We have a primary care physician who can work with, who's a pediatrician, so they can work with folks ages 4 to 30 and provide regular checkups as well as gender-affirming care, so they can prescribe puberty blockers and hormones. And we also have community mental health, so individual, group, and family counseling and case management. And all of those services are free, and if someone has Medicaid and it's billable, we would bill Medicaid. And then the last service I want to talk about is our home-based services through the Ruth Ellis Center, and this is our family work. I wanted to talk about this a little bit more than the other areas briefly because the family work, I think, is often very connected to this longer timeline of how we understand and serve youth who are in foster care. And so we work with youth who identify as LGBTQ and their families while they're still in the home. And most of our referrals come from Child Protective Services. And the investigator has determined that it is safe for the young person to stay at home with their family as long as they get services. So this is family preservation work. We have a counselor, a case manager, and a parent support partner who go to the home every week, and their role is to facilitate safety for the young person, facilitate a plan based on the family's stated needs, and within that integrate activities around psychoeducation and cognitive behavioral therapy that support the parents or primary caregiver in understanding how their behavior has a direct impact on their child's health and safety outcomes, especially as it relates to their child's sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. So this is about preventing young people from going into the foster care system and keeping children at home if at all possible, which is work that we are very proud of, and is also work that can continue along the spectrum of care. So if a young person does go into foster care, they still might have visitation with their family, and so this is a service that can also happen while a child is not in the home but has potential to reunite with their family or has visitation. And then this is also work that we really believe is important for young people as they exit foster care, because as many of you I'm sure are aware, many young folks reconnect with their families after leaving foster care, which might be happening while they're also pursuing post-secondary education and connecting with you all as resources. So we are really big believers, especially for youth who identify as LGBTQ, and finding supports for them to reconnect with their birth families in ways that are safe and healthy for them, which also includes supporting parents or previous primary caregivers and understanding how their behaviors toward their child based on their sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression have a direct impact on their child's health and safety outcomes. So all of this work relates to the development of cultural and personal identity, obviously. Almost all the youth who come to the Ruth Ellis Center, if it's not obvious at this point, identify as LGBTQ. Almost all the youth who come to the Ruth Ellis Center identify as African American or more than one race. And most of the youth are male, and most of the youth who come to our space do not have, whether they are in foster care or not, do not have a lot of access to financial resources. Historically, their families have not either. So there's a lot of resource navigation related to socioeconomic class that we do. And then a very important part of our work, I think as Maddie mentioned earlier, when we think about social identity, it's about recognizing not just someone's sexual orientation, because that may or may not be central to an individual's sense of self. It's also about listening to what other social identities are important to a young person and what intersections of those social identities are really central to how they name their experiences and the narrative of their life and their strengths. And so for a lot of the youth who we work with, their identity as a person of color or as a young person who has really found a way to be resilient in the foster care system, you know, those are sometimes more central or important identities to a young person than identifying as LGBTQ, and we absolutely respect that. The space is, especially for the residential space, to be affirming is often something that when young people arrive, they've not experienced otherwise. So another part of identity development sometimes is learning that when we create those safe spaces, that is when someone realizes, oh, this part of who I am is not a negative thing like people have been telling me. This is a part of who I am which is beautiful and a strength and important. And unfortunately, a lot of young people don't experience that until their post-secondary education experience. So if we can go to the next slide, I think that having that conversation is really important in thinking about how in your all's roles and helping support youth in getting ready for post-secondary, as well as when they're in post-secondary education, how affirming their cultural and social identities is really important component of their experience, and especially thinking about the intersection of their experiences with foster care. So the first thing I would point out when we're thinking about working with youth related to their cultural identity and post-secondary access and success is to just recognize that because of the actual age that most people are at, typically between 18 and 28 when they're working on post-secondary education, not always, but often. This is, regardless of how an individual identifies, for everyone at this stage in our development, our psychosocial development, identity and really naming identity is a key part of our connectedness and our experiences. So what I would also point out is we know that youth who are in foster care are often disproportionately of social identities that have experienced more oppression. And so when we are supporting foster care youth in going and pursuing post-secondary education, not always, but often, they are in spaces where they are a minority. So most of our post-secondary resources and students, unfortunately, in the United States are still very white, still very middle and upper class, are still very focused on typical abilities and we're not as good as we need to be at working with people based on different abilities, and especially in post-secondary education. And so for foster youth that we work with, when they arrive in these environments, there's a deep sense of otherness. And so really supporting foster youth and finding communities of people that they identify with so that they don't feel as isolated and feel supported is extremely important. So most universities have Black student associations or have women's centers. Most universities have support for people who have different learning styles or different abilities. And then some universities have LGBTQ identity-focused groups, or they might call them gay-straight alliances. There's a lot of different names, but we would really recommend thinking about, as a way to support a young person that you're working with, learning more about their interest and their sense of self and any cultural or social identities that are important to them, and making sure that they know about student groups that are options to connect with on campus. And also understand that they might not be interested in that, and that's also okay. People don't have to be locked into, you know, being out and loud about certain identities. Some people, that's not really where they are in their understanding of themselves, or because of their personality, that's not really how they process or connect to themselves. So it's important to respect that, but also make sure that we're building those options for young people. And then the other thing I would mention just before we go to the next slide is to think about how identity development, especially related to cultural identity for foster care youth, how that can look with more freedom in a post-secondary environment. So sometimes youth come from residential facilities or foster care environments that had a lot of, you know, structure and a lot of straightforward guidelines and rules. And so when they have more freedom and they're in a new space, that might be the space that they needed to learn more about their personal or cultural identities that they didn't really have the space to do before. And so sometimes youth might surprise us if you work with a young person before they go to post-secondary education, and you're working with them once they're in post-secondary education, and you're learning more about how they name and understand and feel about their cultural identities. This is where we often see what we perceive as a lot of change, but it's not necessarily change. It's just an uncovering of who someone is and them feeling safe sharing in different or new ways once they're in a new educational and sometimes residential environment. So if we want to go to the next slide.
Yeah, and Jessie, I just want to jump in and say I really appreciate you bringing up that last point, because I think often, you know, when young people have these relationships, maybe, you know, a caseworker or a mentor or a supportive adult who has known them, you know, maybe in high school age, and then that young person goes into a post-secondary space and is maybe even exposed to a broader social group and different, you know, even just different kind of cultural norms within the campus, different opportunities to engage and discover and explore just the vastness of identities that are out there. We have seen, you know, a number of young people kind of say, oh, you know, these supportive adults, these folks who, you know, were really so crucial to my success have sort of pulled away because now I'm identifying in a different way. And I think it's really important that folks understand that just as our young people are developing in their skills and abilities and talents, their identity is developing and becoming more dynamic. And so I really appreciate you bringing that up. And I'll turn it back over to you and just say, you know, I know we have this here saying what is one thing that attendees can do. I know you have many things, so feel free to share a few kind of insights that you have for the folks that are listening today.
Right. Thank you, Maddie. Yeah, and I think to your point too, I really appreciate you highlighting that. I have a lot of friends, and this may or may not be true for youth in foster care, because, you know, fortunately there are some resources, financial resources for youth in foster care to have post-secondary education access. But sometimes there are financial resources outside of, you know, directly having the courses paid for, so even just having some extra spending money or enough money for books might be dependent on a resource parent from their past or some kind of connection. And it is often the experiences of LGBTQ people that when they come out as young adults during their post-secondary experience, that their natural supports in their lives threaten to remove financial support for them if they come out, or if they come out in a certain way. And so there's a lot of stress at this time for young people to navigate that, and I think that isn't just specific to LGBTQ identity. I think that for young people related to race or class, and really finding more resources to be affirmed in their social identities is so important, but sometimes where they came from before their post-secondary education, that environment or that foster family didn't have as many resources or support as they needed to be affirming of the child's social identity, and so it can sometimes be isolating from people who were previously natural supports or resources in that young person's life. So, so this gets us to, arguably the most important slide, which is what can we actually do to improve outcomes for young adults? And I think that this is an extremely important question. And so I'll just go through a few initial pieces. But again, the first one is really about in your role, and everyone plays a different role with young people, but in your role, do you actually know how the young person that you're working with identifies? If it's appropriate in your role, if you have done an intake at some point with this young person, if you have file information, we typically know people's date of birth. We know the sex assigned at birth on their birth certificate. We know if they've been in foster care or not. We often know their race or ethnicity, but we do not often, in a systematic way on intake forms, ask about sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. And depending on our role, that might not be a good fit for the intake, but for many people's roles, if you're doing any kind of wraparound or therapeutic support, we absolutely recommend that, as long as it is compulsory, so as long as it's a part of your form, in the same way you ask everyone their date of birth, as long as it is confidential and respectful and optional, that everyone should be asked about their sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. Because if you don't have that information, you're missing opportunities to help that person be safe and healthy. So an example that comes up that I think of a lot that happened in the past was that there was a young person working with a counselor, and when I say young person, they're about 20 years old, they were a young adult. They're working with a counselor at a community mental health agency in Detroit, and they had been seeing this counselor for almost a year. They really liked them. And this counselor was working with them to get a job, and they ended up leaving the counselor and not working with them anymore and coming to the Ruth Ellis Center. And so I was speaking with them and asking them, so like I remember you saying you really liked this person, you would share a lot with them, you felt safe with them. Why did you end up, coming here to do job support, just out of curiosity? And they said, oh, well, my counselor doesn't know I'm a girl. And I said, what do you mean? Explain that. And so this young person identifies as a girl, and they're transgender. So they were assigned male at birth. So if you looked at just their paperwork, it says male on their birth certificate. And because they had learned to navigate the world thinking of safety at all times, when they started going to see this counselor, they would dress more as traditionally as males do. So they would dress really masculine, even though that was not how they identified, because they knew that that counselor was getting paperwork that said that they were assigned male, and they, out of a fear for their safety or access to services, wanted to not really rock the boat, so they went dressed as a man. And so outside of this counseling appointment, this young person always otherwise was dressing feminine, identifies as a woman, you might not even recognize the person who is going to the counseling session if you saw them in any other area of their life. And so I asked them, did this counselor say something that made you feel like they were unsafe for you to be out as yourself as a trans woman? Did they do something? They said, no, they didn't really do anything, but they didn't ask, and they didn't have they didn't really have any signage up or resources about it, and you just never know. And I thought that that was a really good point that they shared, that unless we make the effort as providers, which puts us in a position of power, unless we make an effort to identify ourselves as safe people and provide a safe, confidential, respectful space for people to share all of themselves, not just part of themselves, if we're not soliciting that information, we're probably not going to get it, especially if people have had unsafe experiences in the past sharing that information. So long story short, what this resulted in is because this counselor did not have this information about this young person and knowing their actual gender identity, the young person realized that they were not equipped to find them a job because they did not understand that they needed to find a job where they could possibly be safe being themselves as a woman, because they didn't want to have a job where they were forced to be closeted and pretend to be a man all the time. And so making sure that we really create spaces where youth can share all of themselves and feel safe doing that will help us provide much stronger and more accurate services. And as that relates to post-secondary education, I think that helping young people find coursework or student groups that help them explore and feel affirmed about who they are is an extremely important step for anyone at any point in their lives. But again, especially as young adults developmentally, that is a really big need and key stage in an individual's lives at that point. Another thing that I would say and invite people to think about as they're working with students and thinking about how to support them in their social identities, and with foster care students and youth specifically, is thinking about biofamily. So knowing that a lot of young adults are likely to reconnect with biofamily at some point, and for some folks that might mean actually moving back in. For other folks that might mean just having a phone call. Many of the youth that we work with will kind of go back for the holidays and reconnect on some level. But in our roles in working with post-secondary education and foster care youth, I would encourage us to think about how to help facilitate that as a safe experience and reconnecting with biofamily if that is something that a young person decides to do. And if it is not our role, making sure that they know if they are interested in that, resources, whether it's on campus or through an agency that they can connect with to help that be a safe experience. And when I say safe, I think what often comes to people's mind is physical safety, but I think that for a lot of our young folks, if they were removed from homes, and that's what the result was foster care. We know that neglect and birth parents having resources to overcome addiction, that those are all big components of this as well. And so making sure that youth are equipped with how to reapproach families is extremely important. And for LGBTQ youth at the Ruth Ellis Center specifically, we utilize the Family Acceptance Project curriculum and research to inform and kind of guide what that can look like. And typically that's facilitated by a counselor. And so long story short, the Family Acceptance Project worked with families for years who had children who identified as LGBTQ, and these families kind of were across the whole spectrum of how they felt about their children. Some of them were extremely rejecting, and some of those children had to go into foster care as a result of that because their home was not safe. Some of the families were more accepting and open. Most of the families were somewhere in between. But what they did was they studied the behaviors of the parents toward the children, and then once those LGBTQ children were young adults, they had them do a survey related to their health and safety outcomes. So the framing of the study is actually not so different than the ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, and really looking at how experiences as children has an impact on specific health and safety outcomes as adults. And so, but more specifically than that, they were looking at how the behavior of the primary caregivers have a direct impact on a child's health and safety. And so from that study, there were several statistically significant findings, but the biggest one was suicidality. So if you took two children, both who identified as gay, and one was in a home where they were experiencing more rejection based on their gay identity, and one was in a home where they're experiencing more acceptance based on their gay identity, the child in the rejecting home was 8.4 times more likely to attempt suicide by the time they were age 25. So what this study allows us to do in our family work, which again very much extends to foster youth and post-secondary education, is when we're talking with families about their interactions with their children, we're not challenging their beliefs, we're not telling them to change their religion, we are approaching them within their cultural and religious framework and underscoring how that is not mutually exclusive from certain behaviors that we know will reduce their child's chances of suicidality. The other health outcomes that reducing rejecting behaviors are tied to are depression, substance use, and STIs and HIV. So this really shifts the conversation away from what parents or primary caregivers or resource parents believe to how their behavior has an impact on their child, whether it's, again, their birth child, their foster care child. So that work is extremely important and we know has a huge impact on the health and safety of youth, especially youth who have been in foster care all the way through their post-secondary education experience. So we definitely want to encourage folks to consider if there are resources within your agency or at your university for that kind of family work. That a lot of times we assume that family work only needs to happen with minors, but that especially for foster care youth, because they're reconnecting with natural supports or maybe revisiting old supports in ways that are extremely vulnerable, that if there's a way to facilitate that, we really encourage that, and to make sure that as we're facilitating it, it is not exclusive to just what is evident on the surface, but also exploring social identity around race, ethnicity, class, sexual orientation, gender identity, all of those kind of social identities, cultural identities that we talked about earlier. So I'm not sure if Maddie had anything else she wanted to add to that. But if not, we can...
I was just going to say, Jessie, I really appreciate you talking about kind of this, and you did it so well and so quickly for the density of the topic, but talking about kind of this larger issue of the intersection of biological family for young people that have experienced foster care. And we know that for our young people that are in post-secondary, often it's the first time where they're able to even have access to that biological family. And so it becomes quite complex as they're, you know, navigating new spaces of post-secondary and also, you know, revisiting relationships within family. And I love the Family Acceptance Project resource that you shared. And I know you and I talked about this prior to the webinar, but just knowing that there's lots of challenges that come up, but I think that it's also such a great opportunity to work with our students, our young people that have experienced foster care, and just work alongside them as they're doing this exploration, and to be sure that we can help keep them safe in the multiple ways like you spoke to. And so I'll let you go into the resources that you have here, and then for those of you that are listening, just be sure that any questions you have, you're putting in the question sidebar. and we'll be grabbing those and chatting about those in just a few minutes. But I will also let folks know that the resources that Jessie's presenting here, we will make sure that they are available on the FSM website, and of course the links will be available within this PowerPoint, so for folks to be able to revisit these at a later date, but just know that they're available and out there. So I'll turn it back to you, Jessie, and you can just give some highlights of the other resources that you have to share.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. So I just talked about the Family Acceptance Project. They have phenomenal brochures and videos that you can purchase on the website. They also have some public domain resources that have been funded through SAMHSA that are provider manuals for working with families and how to support families, cultural framework and worldview, while also helping them build acceptance and reduce rejecting behaviors toward their LGBTQ child. Trans Bodies, Trans Selves is a phenomenal resource for youth who identify as transgender. And I'm not sure if folks recall the Our Bodies, Ourselves book that came out a while ago that was really about encouraging folks to, in a more objective way, learn about their bodies and how to keep our bodies safe and healthy, ranging from topics like consent all the way to resources for gender-affirming medical care. Lesbian identity development is just a pretty, I think it's very accessible overview for social workers, but it's also a great reminder and tool to help guide us through understanding that, especially when we work with young people over the course of years, sometimes the way that they name their identities change, and that doesn't mean that they're confused or that that's a symptom of something that happened to them necessarily. That's typically an indicator that a young person now has the language to name their identities more accurately and or feels safe finally doing that. And so it's important to remember that that is a part of identity development, person in environment, and that environment, how safe an environment is, can really impact when a young person shares certain things about themselves. And then the final tool is through Casey, Life Skills, that they have an LGBTQ specific assessment tool that is not perfect, but has a lot of really great points. And I think even just looking at it as a provider, to be thinking about the complexity of what it means to be affirmed, what it means for someone to be safe being themselves as LGBTQ, and it really just gets down to everyday life examples that can help someone quantify what they want to ask for more help on, what they want to learn more about, what they want to be more connected to. So definitely check those tools out.
Wonderful. And I know that a lot of the folks that have, maybe are involved with DHHS are using the INSEL Life Skills Assessment. But just to highlight that this is a sub-assessment tool, and so if you're if you have a login and you're familiar with just the general life assessment, that do kind of dig deeper and look for this tool, because I think it's definitely a helpful one. And again, that tool is another one that I would say, this isn't a tool to do to a student, it's something to do with your students.
Correct, so, absolutely.
As you go through it, it should be something that you are working with your student and then having open discussions about, so what does this mean, and how do you want to make goals or steps forward in different areas that are identified.
Absolutely.
So the last thing that I have for you, Jessie, you've shared such a tremendous amount of information, and it's so helpful. And I think our folks that are out there listening are probably, furiously writing things down, and we'll be looking forward to, sharing this with their other colleagues. And so within all of that, you do a ton. The Ruth Ellis Center does a ton of work, and I would just love to have you share a humble brag, so something that you're super proud of, or something that gets you excited about the work that you're doing to support student experience in foster care in the identity domain.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for asking. Well, I think the first thing I would say is a humble brag of the Ruth Ellis Center, really, which I am very proud to have been a part of now for almost 7 years, is that we are very committed to constantly implementing and reevaluating our use of trauma-informed care, positive youth development, harm reduction, and restorative justice. And I guess I consider that a humble brag because if you all have been doing this work, you know that it takes a lot of energy and work to not just focus on the what of our work, but to focus on the how of our work. And we think at Ruth Ellis Center that the how is so important. This work is too important to engage in practices that we know don't work. So by engaging in the how and having a framework of some of these principles, it has really, I think, allowed us to connect with young people in ways that we would not have been able to connect with young people, especially the most vulnerable young people in our systems of care otherwise. And I'm also proud to share that over the last 2 years now, the Ruth Ellis Center has had over 1,000 unique contacts. So a lot of times people assume that we're we are a smaller agency, but you know, they're surprised to hear that there are 1,000 LGBTQ youth who are either in foster care or experiencing homelessness, or engaged in community mental health services in Wayne County that are, you know, really looking for those specific services. So, you know, we've really done the work with our systems of care in Wayne County to connect with a lot of young people, and that is something that we're proud of.
That's awesome, and I just think your work so well defines kind of the values that FSM holds as far as doing what you do best and really working in partnership and in tandem with others to ensure that you are offering the best service possible to young people. And I love that you spoke to, you know, sort of the power of the how and, you know, data-driven decision-making and kind of constantly evaluating, you know, how your services are being effective and how they're being implemented in the best way possible. So I just want to say thank you again so much for your presentation today. We do have time for just a couple questions. And again, so if you're out there and you want to ask us some questions, let us know. We have a couple here that we have, and so we'll take questions for the next few minutes, and then we'll be sure that we'll share Jessie's information because I'm sure many of you are interested in following that. So the first question that we have here is, what are some common identity-related challenges that you regularly run into, and how can professionals and supportive adults better recognize and address these challenges? So thoughts for you, Jessie.
Yeah, great question. So this could probably be a whole webinar, right? But I think, and please, if I'm not answering the question clearly, please feel free to ask a follow-up. But I think a lot of times we talk about, we think of identity as a challenge. I had just referred a young person the other day to kind of a crisis center, and the young person asked me, they identify as transgender, and they asked me to call them ahead of time to make sure that they knew that someone whose identity was coming didn't match their birth certificate, because they wanted to give them a heads up, to give them an opportunity to be, you know, safe and affirming for them. And so I called them and they said, oh yeah, thank you for letting us know. We'll make sure that we add that to like the mental health assessment, you know, as like a barrier or a challenge. And the intention was good. The impact of them saying that on me as an LGBTQ person was, oh no, they think that I'm telling them that this is a problem that they're supposed to look for. When I was trying to explain this is a part of this person's cultural and social identity that is to be respected, that is a strength, and also in our society is a barrier. But you know, I think sometimes providers framing identity as a problem or a challenge is something that we see come up a lot, and so we just always want to remind folks that that can be really detrimental to people's sense of self to frame any social identity as a weakness or as a problem. It's important to make sure that people know that this is a unique, beautiful, intrinsic part of who they are. How that looks in a world that is not beautiful always or always safe means it can be a barrier, but that doesn't mean that they have a problem because they are hold a minority cultural identity.
That's excellent. Thank you for that. I love that. The last question, and I didn't realize that we were kind of running short on time, but the last question that I have here is kind of from your view, and your views can be your own here, but if you could share sort of the importance and maybe sort of the role, I guess I would say, that an ally can be in advocating. So an ally that does not identify as LGBTQ, that their role kind of in advocacy and in allyship, given sort of the political and social climate.
Right. Yeah, I think that the question is more important than ever. And, to expand this even outside of LGBTQ identity, I think that for any of our social or cultural identities where we hold privilege or power, that it is important for us to be an ally to the community or to an individual that is experiencing oppression. So if, for someone who identifies as white, recognizing that it's absolutely part of our role to challenge racism. And so in the same way, people who identify as allies in interpersonal situations to be supportive in classrooms. I think there's, attempts at safe dialogues, but a lot of times LGBTQ students are put on the spot to come out or to speak for the whole community or to defend their identity, and that is sometimes someone is interested in doing that, but a lot of times that would be an instance where it would be important for an ally to step up so that someone does not have to be unsafely outed in a circumstance to help facilitate safety. So there's a lot of roles, even outside of interpersonal examples related to, policy decisions, system change kind of work, where people can show up as allies in a lot of different ways. And I would expect that in all the roles that we play in our work that there would be possibilities. So if folks are interested in learning more about that, we have quite a few trainings, and I know that a lot of the universities also have resources and ally trainings if you want to go deeper with this work moving forward.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I, again, just so appreciate your time. And for everyone out there, we will be sharing Jessie's contact information on the webpage with the recording. We do just want to let folks know that we will be continuing our Identity Domain Month. We will have our Fostering Success Michigan Community Collaborative on January 25th at the Kalamazoo Community Foundation. You can find more information out about that on the FosteringSuccessMichigan.com website. And we just always, as always, want to just gather just a little bit of feedback from those of you that are still hanging out with us. So we have just a couple poll questions. And I'm going to put these questions up live here, and you all can respond to them in real time, and this helps us so that we can continue funding for great webinars like this. So the first question is, how likely is it that, let me launch it for all of you. How likely is it that you will utilize the information shared or the resources shared in today's webinar? So you can go ahead and vote, and it's looking like most folks are saying likely, highly likely. This is great. We love to hear that. All right, so we're going to close that one. And then the next one that we're going to ask is, how has today's webinar increased your knowledge regarding this topic? And it's regarding this domain and its importance for youth with experience in foster care. And so it says most people agree, strongly agree with this. Fantastic. These are super helpful for us just to kind of get a quick snapshot of how these have been useful. And the last question we're going to ask is, would you recommend this webinar to other folks in your networks, professionals or educators? And it looks like most folks are saying likely and highly likely. So I just want to say thank you so much to everybody again for joining us today on this webinar. And as always, please feel free to check back for the next webinar next month. And we look forward to seeing all of you at the end of the month at our community collaborative or sometime soon. Take care.